This is Into the Multiverse with Josh Peck.
Hello and welcome to Into the Multiverse. I am your host, Josh Peck. What if consciousness, human consciousness, is just an interaction in a quantum field, much like mass is? And what does any of that mean? Well, the reason that this is important, especially right now, is my good friend Stephen Bancars and I are getting ready to release our brand new book, The Second Coming of the New Age, forward written by Dr. Michael Heiser. Now, we've talked about this before on this show, that the New Age will take quantum physics things and try to make them into their own things. Whereas quantum physics is a science, New Age is really kind of a hodgepodge of different religions and different belief systems and things like that. And in just a couple of weeks, in like 2 or 3 weeks from this episode, you're going to get a full 4 weeks of interviews from Stephen Bancars. I had him in the studio and interviewed him, and so we're gonna release those soon. But part of what we talked about is how the New Age will take these quantum terms, these terms from quantum physics, and try to apply them into their own belief systems and spiritual religions and things like that. The problem with that, though, is their claims are completely antithetical to what the science actually shows. Now, you might be thinking, well, Josh, aren't you just doing that same thing? Aren't you just taking quantum physics and incorporating it into reality? Well, the difference is I'm not trying to mess with the data in order to force it to fit into Christianity. The science is what it is. That's just what it is. Now, there is a difference between observation and interpretation. You can have a certain set of data from an experiment, but what that means, that's up to interpretation. That's more of a subjective thing. But the objective reality of experimental data, mathematics, things like that and things like Christianity, if they're both true, should fit hand in hand, and you shouldn't have to twist one or the other. So in my books and on this show, I try not to do that. I don't try to warp one so that the other one can fit. But the New Age is different. What New Age will do is they'll take just a piece of quantum physics. They'll take one piece of it. They won't spend time to understand it very well or to really care necessarily what the experimental data shows, and then they'll develop a doctrine out of it. That's not what we're doing here. We don't take a quantum experiment or a piece of information from quantum physics and then build a whole doctrine around it. What I've been doing is trying to see where Christianity and where quantum physics can connect. Do they connect in every possible conceivable way? No, probably not. But that also doesn't mean that they contradict either. There are just sometimes one thing doesn't have anything to do with another. Just like the Bible isn't necessarily a science book, even though you can find scientific things in it. There are certain things in there. But much in the same way, quantum physics is not a religion, even though you can find the fingerprints of God in creation if you're looking for it there. But again, that all just has to do with interpretation. So the reason that I brought up mass and consciousness is because it relates to this idea. In New Age, there's this idea that everything springs forth from a quantum field of consciousness, and they say that without really understanding what that means. Now, there are scientific hypotheses right now that says consciousness might be an interaction with a quantum field. That might sound confusing, but that's okay. That's what this show is for. You could think of it like mass. Now, mass we think of as substance. We think of mass as just what stuff is made of. It's not exactly accurate. Mass is more comparable to something like electric charge. You can have a positive and a negative. And you might think, well, how can you have a negative mass? Well, if we think of mass as an interaction with something, then it begins to make more sense. And in fact, that is what it is. So there is what's called a quantum field, which is basically just like a set of values in every point in space. It's sort of like if you were submerged in a pool of water, you could consider yourself being in a water field. Now, that's not exactly the same, but it's at least enough to get our heads around it. So the Higgs field is like that. The Higgs field is everywhere. And when our atoms, when our fundamental particles interact with the Higgs field, then that interaction is mass. That's what mass is. It's an actual interaction. That's how a photon, which does not interact with the Higgs field at all, can have zero mass, because it might be tempting to think, how can something exist if it has no mass? When we think of mass as an interaction instead of like substance, then it begins to make a little bit more sense. That's also how scientists were able to develop a liquid that has negative mass effects. You would think, how is that possible? Well, basically, when you push the liquid pushes back at you. It's very, very strange, but again, that's how we know that mass is just an interaction with the Higgs field, because if it was anything else, these types of experiments wouldn't be able to operate correctly. So physicists have been wondering for quite some time, what is consciousness, and how do we define it? How do we put a set of values on consciousness? And it's a very interesting question. So there's an idea that it might be similar to mass, and that consciousness might be an interaction with some quantum field that we have yet to discover. Now, this would only be physical. This would only be physical in reality. It has nothing to do with the soul. It has nothing to do with the spirit. So that level of consciousness, this would not address that. This is just merely on a physical basis. What is physical human consciousness? So the theory is that we have particles in our head called corticons, and those particles in our brain, they interact with the cortical field. And, we go about our day, and as long as that interaction continues, then we still have physical consciousness. Now, when the body dies and when these particles aren't active anymore in the brain, whatever happens after that is still a mystery. We Christians would say, well, the spirit or the soul, that goes to heaven to be with the Lord. And in that case, that type of consciousness is not what we're talking about. That's still you, of course. That's the real you. But actual physical consciousness, the way that we understand it in the physical world, that's what this theory would be addressing. Now, of course, because the New Age is the New Age, they have taken this idea and have decided that all of reality is birthed out of this field of consciousness, that the consciousness field is the fundamental field, which, by the way, there's no evidence to support there is a fundamental field, fundamental meaning one field of which all other fields spring forth. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, no real reason to believe that. Doesn't mean it's not true, might be true, they might discover that someday, but it really doesn't matter, and it doesn't really fit with this. Because what the New Age will say is that all of creation is birthed from this consciousness field, yet the field itself doesn't have consciousness, but somehow that impersonal conscious field is God, in a sense. It's a force. It's the creator of all things. Now, I have no problem with the idea that there might be a consciousness field where an interaction between the particle of that field, corticons, let's say, and then the cortical field itself produces some type of physical consciousness with us. But that doesn't address anything spiritual. That's just the physical mechanism. So the idea that a conscious field, like the New Age would say, would produce not only us, but all spiritual beings as well, really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because that type of force in that type of way would have to be conscious. How could it be impersonal and unconscious, yet create consciousness? And that's never really explained. And that's why it's so different from the idea of God, because God is personal. He wants a relationship with us, but he also expects things out of us. We're held accountable to him. And there's the crux of the issue. The New Age doesn't want to be accountable to anybody but themselves. They elevate themselves as their own God. Think about it. If all of creation came from an unconscious, consciousness field, who would be the God in your life? It would be you, because you would know better than just some force or some field out there. So that's really what the New Age is after. And that's why it's important for us to understand really what quantum physics is talking about. Quantum physics is so mysterious, it's really easy to take these issues and turn them into something that they were never meant to be, especially when we have physicists who, essentially speak a different language than the rest of us. And I do believe that many times they try very hard to be precise in their language, knowledge when a discovery is made or when they're explaining something to the media, but that gets twisted around very easily. That's why the Higgs boson ended up being called the God particle. Physicists actually really typically don't like that name, not because they hate God or anything, but because it doesn't address what the particle actually is. It doesn't address that particle discovery wasn't the real discovery. The discovery was that there's a Higgs field, because every field produces a fundamental particle. So the electromagnetic field produces photons, the gravitational field presumably produces gravitons, though they have not yet been discovered, but we know there's a gravitational field, if that is what gravity is. Then there should be a graviton. But that's why it's so important, because New Age and other belief systems, they will take these types of things and spiritualize it and turn it into basically a religion. And I'm saying on this show, I've said before and I'll say again, quantum physics is not a religion. It is not. It is a science. Quantum field theory is not a religion. It is a science. It's actually the most precise science we have available today. Is quantum field theory. So I wanted to address that right off the bat in preparation for these next few weeks. It'll begin in a couple of weeks, but then we'll have a few weeks of interviews with Stephen Bancars. So you can kind of get the groundwork taken care of now for those upcoming interviews. And that book, again, is called The Second Coming of the New Age, written by myself and Stephen Bancars. The foreword was written by Dr. Michael Heiser, and he gave a ringing endorsement of it. So this is theologically sound. He obviously read the thing. And so you can rest assured there's some good information in there, and it's stuff that we desperately need to know. We need to know now. So make sure to keep your eyes out for Skywatch TV for those programs. There will be a few weeks of network programs. There's going to be web exclusive stuff like Into the Multiverse, many things like that. And of course, as always, there's going to be a mega package attached to this with a bunch of cool materials that you can't get anywhere else. We are working very hard on those right now, and you'll be happy with what we've been able to come up with. All right. Well, all that being said, I want to thank you so much, and please leave a comment. I would like to know what you think consciousness is. It's a good question, and I think it's something that's good for us to talk about. What is consciousness? Is it purely spiritual, or is there a physical component? I personally think there's probably a physical component, like most things in life. We have a spiritual life. We are a spiritual being, but there's also a physical component to that, because we have a body with a heart that beats and a brain that goes through neural processes and things. So I think consciousness is likely something similar to that. But I'm curious to know what you think. Do you think it's purely spiritual, purely physical? Do you think it's a combination of the two? What is consciousness? And is that a question worth pursuing in the scientific community? I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care and God bless.
Warren Marcus helps unlock the meaning from the ancient Hebrew of God's priestly prayer of the blessing, and unfolds the mystery of this end times revelation on how this prayer, written by God Himself, can help you in your daily walk towards supernatural health, divine provision, and the power and authority to fulfill your God-given destiny and purpose. Skywatch TV is proud to announce the ancient priestly prayer of the blessing special offer. Through Warren's revelatory book, you'll discover the supernatural power of the Hebrew language, that the Shekinah glory is the manifest presence of the Heavenly Father, that Jesus Himself, the high priest of the new covenant, prayed this divine prayer over His disciples as He ascended into heaven, and that He's ready to pronounce this divine prayer over you now. Plus, order now and receive this beautiful, authentic, numbered replica of the ancient priestly prayer pendant with chain. In 1979, a Jewish archaeologist, Gabriel Barkay, discovered 2 silver amulets in a cave opposite the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Inscribed on the silver in the ancient Paleo-Hebrew was the ancient priestly prayer of the blessing. It is the oldest intact Bible scripture in existence today, and is 400 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. The front of this incredible, beautifully crafted pendant is inscribed with the divine prayer written in the ancient Paleo-Hebrew as originally discovered. The back includes the prayer inscribed in English just as we have in our Bibles today. Also included with each pendant, you'll receive an accompanying priestly prayer mini booklet, so you can carry the prayer with you and proclaim it over yourself wherever you go. But that's not all. Included within the pages of the mini booklet, a special free internet link where you can see and hear the divine prayer pronounced over you by Warren Marcus in the Amplified Hebrew to English translation. And you can hear world-renowned Messianic worship leader Paul Wilbur singing the divine prayer over you in Hebrew. Sold separately, these items hold a retail value of over $55. Yours now for your donation of only $30 plus shipping and handling. The Ancient Priestly Prayer of the Blessing special offer, available now at skywatchtvstore.com. Order now or call 1-844-750-4985.